Hello everyone, DarkOfAllTrades here. For this video, I'm going to try addressing more than one person in a single video. Who could possibly fit more than one person into a video at a time, you ask? Well, it's this channel called The Think Institute, and their video, Yes, Atheists Do Bear the Burden of Proof, and Here's Why. Now, I can already see the comments, no they don't unless they're specifically making a claim, and that's not how the burden of proof works, and others like that. Well, the title promises that they will explain why, so let's take a look. Play that 80s music. I love 80s music. Solid choice, no notes.
I'll say quickly that when you mentioned that the flying spaghetti monster or whatever, like when I heard that argument and thought about it a little bit, I don't know, I think I heard it a year ago or something. But really, like, because then they say, like, well, we don't have to prove there's a God because if who's ever making basically this statement is at the burden of proof, who's ever making the positive statement.
Yes, excellent. This guy gets it. The burden of proof in any situation is on the person making a positive statement. I was in a discussion recently where someone said claiming there is no God is not a positive statement. Of course, this is not quite the case. A positive statement in this situation is a statement about what is, was, or will be. It is the claim about the facts of reality. This means that saying something exists is a positive statement, but also saying something does not exist is also a positive statement as well, because both of these assertions are about the facts of reality. Thus, people can be mistaken on the atheist side as well.
But really, it's who's ever making the more absurd statement.
Oh, I see you don't get it. Absurdity does not come into play when it comes to the burden of proof. One could argue that the existence of a giraffe is pretty absurd compared to a unicorn. We have horses, we have animals with horns, so realistically, the physical nature of a unicorn makes sense. Look at these pictures and tell me that this couldn't be a super easy thing to do for either a god or natural selection. However, if you said we had a four-legged deer-horse hybrid that stands twice as tall as any of its closest related animals we have today at 19 feet tall, with 6 feet of that being just its neck, anyone who didn't know about giraffes would think you were being pretty absurd. Seriously, take a look at these things. Tell me someone didn't mess up a drawing and produce them. So, if you compare those two statements, you would be saying that the burden of proof is on the person who says that giraffes exist but unicorns don't, compared to the other way around. No, the burden of proof is on both people because they are making positive claims. Otherwise, what? We have two claims. One is more absurd than the other. Therefore, if the people claiming that giraffes exist couldn't prove it, that means that unicorns exist by default? Now that is absurd.
And so in that case, then you could just go back to, well, actually, I would say you're making the more absurd statement saying there's not a God.
Atheists don't necessarily make the claim that there is not a God, but merely don't accept your claim that there is a God. If we look at the normative properties of a God, it sounds pretty absurd to me. While I personally do assert that there is not a God, how did you determine that my claim was more absurd than yours? You don't get to assert that because I said something you don't believe and you said something you do believe, that my claim is absurd and yours isn't, because I could use the exact same logic on you. Then how do we determine who's more absurd? We would have to spend even more time addressing each claim individually to check for absurdity, arguing who is more absurd when we should be addressing the truth of the claims. A positive statement is not subjective, while absurdity is. That is why we don't use absurdity as a standard for determining the burden of proof.
Yeah, and Johnny, I'm gonna take that even one step further, because even the idea of absurdity presupposes a standard of reasonableness.
I guess this is accurate, however, it is virtually nonsensical. What I find reasonable and what you find reasonable may be different. If you, as a religious person, met an atheist who is angry all the time, you may conclude that that person is an angry person. If you met 100 atheists who were angry every time you met them, then you may start to formulate opinions about atheists as angry people. But if every atheist you have ever met has been angry in every encounter you have witnessed, then it may be reasonable for you to conclude that atheists are all angry people. Does this make you correct? No. Were you unreasonable? I think you would have a strong case that you're not being unreasonable. It's just that you don't have the same information that others do. I'll bet this is going to go into some presuppositional argument, right?
Sure.
And the atheist doesn't get to judge what's more or less absurd.
Yes we do. The idea of whether I accept the claim in some number of gods existing or not has no bearing on whether I can judge other claims to be reasonable or not. This is a non sequitur. Even granting that the logic of an atheist on the claim about a god is wrong, your conclusion that they cannot judge what is absurd does not follow. This could potentially be a fallacy of composition as well, because he's asserting that because the logic is bad on one claim, therefore it must be bad on all points, depending on how he continues. Though I am curious, how does one judge what is absurd and what isn't?
Because they have no ultimate reference point. Remember, the atheist says there's no God. So there is no ultimate reference point by which we judge what's absurd and what's not.
The ultimate reference point would be the facts of reality. We make evaluations on claims to determine whether they are true or not compared to reality. However, let me grant this to make his point as strong as possible. Atheists do not have an ultimate reference point because there is no God. Basically saying, if there is no God, then there is no ultimate reference point for what is absurd and what isn't. I can grant this entirely. We have no ultimate reference point. However, you also do not have an ultimate reference point either. You just claim to have one. Even granting that some God exists, you have no demonstrable facts about what this God thinks, feels, wants, likes, doesn't like, or finds absurd. Taking that a step further, even if you knew literally all of this, it is still entirely subjective. It is based on what this God thinks, and not objective reality. What this God thinks has no bearing on what actually exists in reality. So there is no ultimate reference point either way. However, I will go yet another step further. If a God exists and you base your opinion on what is absurd on this God, if it has no effects on the facts of reality, then it is useless. Therefore, reality supersedes your God's opinion. Whether there is a God or not, you are still wrong.
I'm going to say, the burden of proof, this idea that only Christians have the burden of proof, don't ever, please don't ever buy into that. That is, you give that up, you're giving away the farm.
Who said that only Christians have the burden of proof? If there are two people, one Christian and one not, and the Christian is making the claim and the other person is not, then I guess only the Christian has the burden of proof. However, the burden of proof still lies with whoever is making the positive claim, as Christians are doing it when it comes to the assertion that a God exists. If the other person is making the counterclaim that their God does not exist, then yes, they also adopt a burden of proof. Why? Because they have made a claim as well, independent of the first claim.
Because on what possible ground would the atheists judge who has the burden of proof?
On the grounds that we accept the burden of proof lies with whoever is making the positive claim. Otherwise, we would be forced to accept contradictory claims. If we have 3 claims and 2 are equally absurd, but contradictory, and the third is more absurd, we wouldn't say the first 2 claims do not have a burden of proof, would we? No. Why? Because that is not how the burden of proof works. This is really basic stuff, guys. Just pick up any philosophy book that talks about the burden of proof.
What rule book is he playing from?
Ha! I hadn't listened to that part before writing my last line. We are playing from the rules of logic and reason. If you put forth that someone making a claim in any circumstance must be accepted without that person adopting a burden of proof, then you effectively have an argument from ignorance fallacy.
No. The Christian, it's against the rules for the atheist to have the burden of proof. Says who?
Says literally no one.
By what standard, man?
By the standard of whoever's making a positive claim adopts a burden of proof, man. If the atheist does not accept your claim, then they are not making a positive statement. Therefore, do not adopt a burden of proof. However, if they are making the counterclaim specifically that there is no God, then they would adopt a burden of proof.
The burden of proof, if anybody's got a burden of proof, it's both. Anybody who's making any claim about anything should be able to back it up.
See, this guy gets it. Wait a minute. I thought he was going to expand on the point that the burden of proof is on the more absurd claim.
Cool. Great answer.
Yeah. I don't buy that burden of proof deal. And I have atheists tell me all the time, you're shifting the burden of proof. From what to what, man?
When you deflect from your burden to attempt to get someone to prove your point otherwise, that is shifting the burden of proof. If you make the claim that a God exists and you try to shirk that burden by asking for evidence that could disprove your claim, that is shifting the burden of proof.
And you live in a shiftless, formless, shapeless universe about which you can know nothing, and yet you're making these hyper-rationalistic statements about all of reality. And
well, this is something. Ignoring the rambling about what universe in which he thinks atheists live, there are rules for the burden of proof. You even acknowledge the criteria yourself.
There are these rules out there about who has the burden of proof. I don't think so. I'm not playing out of your rule book. I reject it out of hand. No, if you're rejecting my Bible, I'm rejecting whatever your rule book is about burden of proof.
Wow, I am just flabbergasted that anyone would say this. We are rejecting the Bible because it is literally just claims on which you're basing your arguments. Those claims are not supported with sufficient evidence. The rulebook about the burden of proof is philosophy and logic 101, which you accept anyway. This statement was so profoundly weird that I was taken aback for a moment.
You're not God.
I left this in because he gets so little right in this video, and I wanted to give him this. Yes, I am not God, nor do I claim to be God. Neither are you. Your God doesn't exist, so I have to give you this point. 100% true facts.
At least my rule book is written by God.
Prove it. If you could even prove that any kind of God exists, then we wouldn't be atheists. But you can't even demonstrate the existence of any God, let alone that God wrote any book, let alone the book that you really don't follow but claim to adhere to. Even so, why should we care about what your God wrote? The burden of proof is on whoever makes the positive claim, irrespective of whether some God wrote some book or not.
You don't even claim that yours is written by God.
Hey, look, another 100% true fact. I don't believe a God exists, let alone could write a book. So what?
It's just the way things are. I don't think so.
Well, if we can't agree on the fundamental rules of reality, then we're not having a conversation, are we? If I am following the fundamental rules of logic and reason, and you are saying that we can't use logic or reason to make determinations, then we don't have a conversation. We need to presuppose the laws of logic in order to make any evaluations. Otherwise, we may be forced to accept contradictions. That's the end of this video. Wow, was that a merry-go-round of logical twists or what? I have no idea where these people think the burden of proof actually lies in any situation. They claim it is on the most absurd claim, and then they claim it's on any positive claim. Well, which one is it? While absurd claims fall into the category of positive claims are not necessarily absurd claims, so they cannot both be the standard. That ending, though, am I right? It took a hard turn from philosophy to rejecting fundamental aspects of logic. Wait a minute, weren't they supposed to explain why atheists have the burden of proof? Was that really it? I think anything but my position is absurd. Therefore, atheists have the burden of proof? Is that reasoning convincing to anyone? So what did you think? Did you follow these gentlemen better than I did? Did their position on the burden of proof make sense and I just missed something? Let me know in the comments. What do you think their actual position is? I don't know these people, but it seems like they are presuppositionalists, which is arguably the laziest of apologetics. The original video is less than 2.5 minutes with intro and outro, and I had this much to say on it. It just shows how easy it is to make a lot of bad claims that when evaluated at even a basic level require so much addressing to counter. This is why religious apologists are so well liked in their own communities. Short, mindless sound bites are so wrong that they require pages of explanation. It must be so easy to make baseless assertions. Be sure to endorse the absurdity of YouTube by hitting the like button and subscribe if you want to saddle me with the burden of proof when I make the claim that these kinds of arguments are really strange. As always, keep learning.